April 1241. A blood-soaked field near Legnica. 9 massive sacks sit in the mud, filled to the brim with the severed right ears of European knights. This was the calling card of the Mongol Empire. The Polish crown hadn't just lost a battle, they had lost their future. Their duke was decapitated, his head paraded on a pike as a trophy, and the kingdom was left as a smoking, hollowed-out graveyard. To the Mongol generals, Poland wasn't a rival, it was a training ground. A mere side mission on the road to the Atlantic. But then, the impossible happened. The unstoppable Mongol war machine, a force that had swallowed the Jin dynasty, erased the Khwarezmian Empire, and reduced Russia to a collection of vassal states, suddenly hit a wall it could not break. For 40 years, the Golden Horde returned to Poland, expecting to finish the job. They brought the fire, the terror, and the tactical brilliance of Subotai. Yet, by 1287, the hunters had become the hunted. The invincible horsemen of the apocalypse were being slaughtered in the forests, trapped behind stone walls, and hunted down by a kingdom that refused to stay dead. How does a nation that has been burned to the ground, fractured by civil war, and traumatized by genocide, transform itself into the anvil that finally shattered the Mongol hammer? Most history books stop at 1241. They show you the catastrophe. They don't show you the cold-blooded 40-year evolution of a people who realized that glorious cavalry charges were a suicide pact. They don't tell you about the Stone Revolution, the brutal defensive innovations of Leszek the Black, or the moment the Mongols realized their traditional tactics were being used against them with lethal precision. We are diving into the blood-soaked pages of the 13th century to reveal the ultimate revenge. This isn't just a story of survival. It is a forensic analysis of how Poland engineered the downfall of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. What was the invincible weakness the Mongols didn't know they had? Why did the most feared army on the planet suddenly find itself paralyzed and retreating, never to return as conquerors? To understand the end of the Mongol terror in Europe, we have to go back to the ashes of Krakow, to a moment when the Polish people realized that to kill a monster, they had to change everything about how they lived, built, and fought. This is the untold story of the Mongol Empire's greatest failure. Imagine the year 1241. A thick, choking cloud of dust rises on the eastern horizon, signaling the arrival of a force the likes of which Europe has never seen. These are the horsemen of the apocalypse, the Mongol Golden Horde. Led by the tactical shadow of Subotai, perhaps the greatest military mind to ever live, they don't just invade, they erase. At the Battle of Legnica, the pride of European chivalry, the Polish knights wasn't just defeated, they were systematically slaughtered. Their severed ears were collected in sacks, and the head of Duke Henry the Pious was paraded on a spear. Poland was a burning graveyard, its cities in ashes, its people traumatized, and its future seemingly extinguished. To the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, Poland was nothing more than a side mission, a mere speed bump on the road to the Atlantic. But history is rarely a straight line. While most chronicles stop at the devastation of 1241, the real story, the one that changed the fate of the West, was just beginning. This is not a tale of a kingdom that stayed broken. This is the story of the ultimate military evolution. Over the next 40 years, out of the ruins of a divided and bleeding nation, something remarkable happened. The Poles didn't just pray for divine intervention. They became the anvil that would eventually shatter the Mongol hammer. In this deep dive, we are stripping away the myths to reveal how a broken kingdom fundamentally re-engineered its entire existence to survive. We will analyze the catastrophic fall of Krakow and the nightmare of the first invasion, where the Mongol feigned retreat tactic turned a battlefield into a slaughterhouse. We'll explore the military genius of Subutai, the man who treated geography like a chessboard. But more importantly, we will witness the rise of Leszek the Black and the revolutionary shift in Polish defense, trading vulnerable wooden walls for impregnable stone fortresses and abandoning the glorious yet suicidal cavalry charges for a brutal, proactive strategy of attrition. By 1287, the Mongols returned, expecting another easy harvest of souls. Instead, they found a trap they couldn't escape. Was it sheer luck, or did Poland discover the one fatal weakness in the Mongol military machine? From the blood-soaked fields of Legnica to the desperate, icy defenses of the late 13th century, this is the untold story of Poland's ultimate revenge. If you've ever wondered how you stop an unstoppable force, you're about to find out. This is the evolution of medieval warfare. This is how the underdog bit back. To understand the sheer magnitude of what Poland was up against, you have to stop thinking about the Mongols as just another medieval army. They weren't. They were a sovereign kinetic energy, a nomadic superstate that moved with the speed of a forest fire and the precision of a Swiss watch. In 1241, the Polish nobility lived in a world governed by the code of chivalry. War was a ritual, a series of localized skirmishes, heavy armor, and honorable charges. To the Mongols, war was a math problem, and the solution was always total annihilation. When the Golden Horde crossed the border, they didn't just bring swords. They brought a level of psychological warfare that Europe couldn't even conceptualize. Imagine being a sentry on the walls of Sandomierz. You've been told the enemy is miles away. Then, within the hour, the horizon turns black. The Mongols could cover up to 100 miles a day, an impossible speed for any European army of the time. They were ghosts that killed. The trauma of 1241 wasn't just the lost battles. It was the realization that the Polish defense system was fundamentally obsolete. At the Battle of Chmielnik, the Polish heavy cavalry, the elite of the elite, charged with lances leveled, expecting a glorious clash of steel. Instead, the Mongols simply opened up. They parted like a curtain, let the heavy knights barrel through into thin air, and then swarmed them from the flanks with a rain of armor-piercing arrows. This was the feigned retreat, and the Poles fell for it every single time. It was like watching a master chess player toy with a child who didn't even know the rules. By the time the smoke cleared from the ruins of Krakow, the Kingdom of Poland didn't just have a leadership vacuum. It had a soul vacuum. Their Duke, Henry the Pious, hadn't just been killed, he had been erased. His head was carried on a pike from city to city as a grim advertisement of Mongol supremacy. This wasn't just conquest, it was the systematic deconstruction of a culture. The survivors weren't hiding in forests thinking about liberation. They were hiding in caves, starving, convinced that the end of the world had arrived. And here is the most agonizing part. To the Mongol generals, Subutai and Batu Khan, this wasn't even their primary objective. Poland was a flank protection mission. They were just clearing the side yard so they could focus on the real prize: Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire. The destruction of a 500-year-old kingdom was, to the Mongols, an administrative chore, a checklist item. But the real mystery begins in the silence that followed. For decades, the Mongols looked at Poland as a vassal state in waiting, a territory they could harvest whenever they felt like it. They had every reason to believe that the Polish problem was solved. They had the better horses, the better bows, the better generals, and a track record of winning every single engagement. They were the apex predators of the 13th century, and Poland was the wounded prey. However, beneath the surface of the charred landscapes, something was shifting. The trauma of 1241 didn't just break the Polish spirit, it cauterized it. It forced a fractured, bickering nobility to realize that their survival depended on something more than bravery. They realized that to fight the Mongols, they had to stop being knights and start being engineers. They had to stop building for prestige and start building for the apocalypse. For 40 years, as the Golden Horde solidified its grip on Russia and China, they ignored the tiny, broken kingdom to their west. They assumed the Poles were busy weeping in their ruins. They were wrong. While the Mongols were perfecting the art of the invasion, the Poles were quietly inventing the science of the hard point. This wasn't a reorganization of an army. It was the total re-engineering of a civilization. They were preparing for the second and third invasions with a cold-blooded pragmatism that would eventually shock the world. But here is the pattern-breaking truth that history books often miss. The Mongol failure in Poland wasn't actually caused by a sudden surge in Polish military brilliance or the Stone Revolution alone. While the Poles were building walls, the invincible Mongol machine was actually rotting from the inside out, not from decadence, but from the very thing that made them so successful. Their absolute, unwavering belief in their own tactical superiority. They were so good at winning that they forgot how to adapt to an enemy that had nothing left to lose. The hunter had become so predictable that the prey had time to design the perfect trap. The Mongols weren't defeated by a bigger army. They were defeated because they arrived at a battle that was no longer being fought on their terms, against an enemy that had spent 40 years learning how to turn the invincible Mongol logic into a death sentence. The question wasn't if the Mongols would return. It was what would happen when they realized the sheep they had come to slaughter had spent the last 4 decades growing iron teeth. To understand the sheer magnitude of the nightmare Poland faced, we have to strip away the romanticized imagery of medieval knights in shining armor. In 1241, that imagery wasn't a symbol of strength, it was a death warrant. When the smoke cleared from the fields of Legnica, the Polish survivors didn't just see a lost battle, they saw the total collapse of their reality. The Mongol Golden Horde hadn't just defeated an army, they had decrypted the very DNA of European warfare and found it laughably easy to exploit. Think about the psychological state of a survivor in 1242. You were raised to believe that the heavy cavalry charge was the ultimate expression of power, a literal wall of iron and horseflesh that nothing could stop. Then, you watched as these barbarians from the east didn't even bother to meet that charge. They danced, they circled, they fired arrows with the cadence of a modern semi-automatic weapon. They turned your bravery into a liability. To the Poles, this wasn't war. It was an alien abduction. It was a force that didn't follow the rules of God or man. The Mongols weren't just good at fighting. They were a sovereign kinetic energy. While the Polish dukes were bickering over tiny parcels of land and debating the finer points of feudal law, the Mongols were operating with a level of logistical sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until the Napoleonic era. They had the Yam, a lightning-fast pony express system that allowed a general in the field to communicate across thousands of miles. They had a meritocratic command structure where a commoner could rise to lead tens of thousands based on nothing but talent. while Poland's leadership was dictated by bloodlines that had grown stagnant and soft. But the real pain of this era, the mystery we have to solve, is why the Mongols didn't just stay. After the 1241 invasion, Poland was an open wound. The cities of Krakow and Sandomierz were charcoal skeletons. The peasantry had been liquidated or driven into the deep, dark forests. There was no centralized army left to stop a permanent occupation. By all the laws of history, Poland should have become another Kipchak Khanate, a permanent colony of the Mongol Empire like Russia or Central Asia. Instead, the Mongols turned around and left. History books often attribute this to the death of the great Khan Ogedei in Mongolia, claiming the generals rushed back to elect a new leader. But that's a convenient oversimplification. The truth is much more chilling. They left because they were finished with their test drive. They had seen everything they needed to see. They viewed Poland not as a prize to be held, but as a resource to be harvested at intervals. To the Golden Horde, Poland was now a vassal in waiting, a farm they could return to every few decades to loot, burn, and remind the Westerners who their masters were. This created a period of agonizing suspense that lasted 40 years. Imagine living in a house where the front door has been kicked in, your family has been terrorized, and the intruder just walks out saying, "I'll be back when you've gathered more valuables." That was the Polish 13th century. It was an era of profound, paralyzing trauma. Every time dust rose on the horizon, every time a messenger arrived from the east, the heart of the nation stopped. And yet, it is in this 40-year silence that the most incredible transformation in military history took place. The Poles realized that if they fought the next war like they fought the last one, they wouldn't just lose, they would be erased from the map. They had to undergo a total system reboot. The first realization was the most painful. The knight was dead. The heavy cavalryman, the pride of the Polish nobility, was essentially a high-maintenance target. The Mongols had proven that mobility and range beat raw power every single time. The second realization was even more radical. Wood was a lie. For centuries, Polish defense relied on wooden palisades and earthworks. The Mongols, however, were masters of Chinese-engineered siege engines. They could turn a wooden fort into a funeral pyre in a matter of hours. So, the Poles began the Stone Revolution. This wasn't just a construction project, it was an act of national desperation. They began to sink every ounce of wealth they had into stone massive, thick-walled fortresses and fortified cities, designed specifically to negate the Mongols' speed and their siege tactics. They were building hard points that couldn't be bypassed and couldn't be easily burned. But even as the walls went up, the internal rot continued. Poland was still a fractured mess of competing duchies. They were poor, they were starving, and they were terrified. How do you coordinate a national defense when you don't even have a single king? This is where the figure of Leszek the Black enters the frame, a man who realized that to defeat the Mongols, you didn't need to be more heroic than them. You had to be more calculating. You had to stop playing the Game of Thrones and start playing the game of survival. The common narrative tells us that Poland simply got lucky, or that the Mongol Empire was spread too thin. We are told that the invincible Mongols eventually just lost interest. But here is the pattern-breaking truth that flips the entire script. The Mongol failure in Poland wasn't caused by their empire getting weaker. It was caused by the Mongols getting better at what they did. Think about that for a second. Usually, an empire fails because it decays. It gets lazy. or it loses its edge. But the Golden Horde that returned to Poland in the 1280s was, on paper, the most efficient and terrifying version of the Mongol army to ever exist. They had more experience, better armor, and more sophisticated tactics than the Horde that had destroyed the world in 1241. They were at the absolute peak of their power. The Mongols didn't lose because they changed. They lost because they refused to change. They were so blinded by their own perfection, so convinced of the mathematical certainty of their victory, that they walked straight into a trap that had been 40 years in the making. They were the ultimate hunters who had forgotten that the most dangerous animal is the one you leave for dead in the ruins. The invincible logic of the Mongol war machine was about to collide with a new Polish logic, one that didn't care about honor, didn't care about chivalry, and was designed for one thing only: to turn the Mongols' own momentum into their executioner. The first test of these iron teeth came in 1259. The Golden Horde returned, led by the ruthless commanders Burundai and Nogai Khan. They rode in expecting another effortless harvest. On paper, it looked like a Mongol victory. The cities of Sandomierz and Krakow were sacked once again. The death toll was catastrophic. But beneath the surface of the burning towns, a terrifying new data point emerged for the Mongol generals. The loot was smaller. The casualties among their own ranks were higher. The sieges that used to take days were suddenly dragging into weeks. The Poles were no longer fighting for chivalry. They were fighting for time. Time was the one resource the Mongol war machine could not afford to lose. A nomadic army survives on momentum. It feeds on the land. If it stops moving, it starts dying. The Poles realized this. They recognized that buying time wasn't just a delay tactic. It was a weapon of mass destruction. But to truly weaponize time, Poland needed an equalizer. They needed a way to kill the untouchable Mongol horse archers without engaging them in the open field. Enter the crossbow. To the old-school European knight, the crossbow was an abomination. It was a coward's tool, devoid of honor. To the new, cold-blooded Polish leadership, it was pure, mathematical perfection. A peasant with 1 week of training could point a heavy crossbow over a stone parapet and punch a steel bolt clean through Mongol lamellar armor at 200 yards. You didn't need a lifetime of elite equestrian training to pull a trigger. You just needed a wall to hide behind. Leszek the Black, the High Duke of Poland, began aggressively stacking his newly built stone fortresses with localized infantry and crossbowmen. But Leszek was a realist. He knew that hiding behind walls was only half the equation. If the Mongols couldn't breach a city, their standard operating procedure was simple: fan out, ravage the countryside, enslave the peasantry, and starve the city into submission. How do you starve an enemy that eats everything? You starve yourself first. Leszek made a decision that would have horrified the prideful dukes of 1241. He implemented a brutal, uncompromising scorched-earth policy. When the scouts reported dust on the eastern horizon in the winter of 1287, the Polish countryside didn't panic. They executed a master plan 40 years in the making. The peasantry evacuated into the heavily fortified stone cities and deep mountain strongholds. They took all the grain. They took all the livestock. What they couldn't take, they burned. They poisoned the wells. They turned the Polish landscape into a frozen, barren wasteland. Then, they waited. Late 1287, the third Mongol invasion. Nogai Khan and Talabuga crossed the ice into Poland with an invasion force of 30,000 hardened veterans. This wasn't a raiding party. This was an extermination fleet. The Mongols executed their textbook operational logic, the split-force pincer movement. Talabuga drove his wing north toward Sandomierz. Nogai Khan pushed south toward Krakow. It was a synchronized shock and awe campaign designed to overwhelm the Polish defenders before they could communicate. It had worked in China. It had worked in Russia. It had worked perfectly in 1241. But the moment Talabuga's horses crossed the border, the Mongol operational calculus violently broke down. There was no food, no grain silos to raid, no isolated villages to plunder. Just black ash, frozen mud, and dead silence. The logistics of a Mongol army are staggering. Every warrior rode with a string of 3 to 4 horses. A 30,000-man army meant roughly 100,000 horses. 100,000 horses require an astronomical amount of grazing grass every single day. In the dead of a Polish winter, in a scorched landscape, the Mongol war machine hit a wall of mass starvation. The ticking clock had started. To survive, Talabuga needed to crack Sandomierz immediately to access its stockpiles. He threw his forces at the city, but the wooden palisades of 1241 were gone. Sandomierz was now an imposing monolith of sheer stone. The Mongols unleashed their siege engineers, but the frozen ground and the biting cold made constructing heavy trebuchets nearly impossible. When the Mongol light cavalry rode in close to unleash their devastating arrow storms, they were met with something they had never faced on this scale: plunging fire. A relentless hail of armor-piercing crossbow bolts rained down from the high stone walls. The Mongols tried their signature move, the feigned retreat. They pulled back, trying to bait the defenders into rushing out after them. The Poles just watched them from the walls. You cannot bait a stone fortress into an open field charge. The psychological damage was immediate. The apex predators of the 13th century found themselves freezing, starving, and dying in the mud outside a city they used to own. Talabuga's wing was effectively paralyzed. But further south, Nogai Khan was closing in on Krakow. Nogai was a living legend. He was the kingmaker of the Golden Horde, a tactical mastermind who rarely tasted defeat. He arrived at the gates of Krakow, expecting the capital to crumble under the weight of his reputation. Instead, he found Wawel Castle completely modernized. The city's defenses had been engineered into a labyrinth of lethal choke points. Nogai assessed the stone walls, looked at his dying horses, and realized a frontal assault was suicide. He didn't have the heavy siege equipment, and his men were severely malnourished. He made the only logical call left in the Mongol playbook. He ordered his commanders to break the army down into smaller units. Fan out, scour the countryside, find weak targets, find food. It was the fatal mistake Leszek the Black had been praying for. The moment the Mongol forces scattered into fragmented foraging parties, the Poles initiated Phase 2. Leszek hadn't just built walls, he had built a rapid response network. As the Mongols bogged down in the snowy forests, fighting starvation and local militias, Leszek finally unleashed his heavy cavalry. The knights were back. But this wasn't 1241. They weren't lining up in an open field to be target practice for Mongol archers. Leszek used his heavy cavalry like precision-guided munitions. Reinforced by a coalition of Hungarian troops led by George of Sovar, the heavy knights swept down from the Carpathian Mountains. They didn't look for a grand, honorable battle. They hunted the isolated Mongol foraging units in the tight valleys and dense woods. This was the Mongol nightmare. In a narrow, snow-filled ravine, a horse archer cannot maneuver. He cannot circle. He cannot retreat. when a wall of heavily armored European knights hits a static, starving Mongol light cavalry unit in a confined space, it isn't a battle, it is an industrial slaughter. The environment itself had been weaponized. The Polish forces systematically isolated and erased the Mongol detachments. The climax of this brutal new tactical doctrine arrived at the Battle of Starvation. A large, localized Mongol force was cornered by the Polish-Hungarian coalition. There was no grand Mongol maneuvering, no brilliant flank attacks. Stripped of their mobility, the Mongols were hacked to pieces in close-quarters combat. The slaughter was absolute. The invincible aura of the Golden Horde shattered in the blood-stained snow of southern Poland. When word of the massacre at Starvation reached Nogai Khan, the impossible happened. The kingmaker of the Mongol Empire panicked. His army was starving. His foraging parties were being hunted like animals. His siege attempts were failing catastrophically. The Polish forces were now actively counterattacking, closing the net around his command camp. Nogai Khan gave the order that no Mongol general ever wanted to give: retreat. It wasn't a tactical withdrawal. It was a chaotic death march. Harassed day and night by Polish skirmishers, freezing in the brutal winter and leaving thousands of dead horses behind, the remnants of the Golden Horde limped back across the borders of the Rus. They had arrived as an unstoppable kinetic energy. They left as broken, starving survivors. The transformation was absolute. The kingdom that had been erased in 1241 had engineered the greatest military upset of the century. They didn't win by outfighting the Mongols in a glorious clash of steel. They won by turning the Mongols' own operational speed, logistical needs, and tactical arrogance against them. Poland had built an anvil, and the Mongol hammer had finally shattered itself upon it. But this wasn't just a localized victory. The disaster in Poland sent a seismic shockwave across the entire Eurasian landmass. The Golden Horde had hit its absolute western limit. The myth of Mongol invincibility in Europe was dead. Yet, the survival of Poland created an entirely new set of terrifying consequences. The Mongols were pushed back, but they weren't destroyed. And as the shattered remnants of Nogai Khan's army returned to the steppe, a dark, internal reckoning was brewing within the Golden Horde. The winter of 1288 didn't just freeze the Mongol army, it froze their empire's entire operating system. Nogai Khan dragged his starving, frostbitten survivors back across the Rus border. He wasn't just bringing back a defeated army. He was bringing back a geopolitical virus, the virus of doubt. To a nomadic superpower, momentum is oxygen. A Khan who stops conquering is a Khan who starts bleeding. Nogai's humiliating failure in Poland shattered his aura of invincibility. But a wounded Mongol warlord is infinitely more dangerous. He didn't accept defeat. He turned his rage inward. The Golden Horde plunged into a catastrophic civil war. Nogai and his rival Tokhta Khan tore the steppe apart in a bloody power struggle. And while the Mongols were busy slaughtering each other, Poland didn't just sit behind its stone walls and celebrate. They looked at the smoking, abandoned Mongol siege camps and realized the apex predators were mortal. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, calculating ambition. How do you exploit a self-destructing empire? You steal their playbook. You don't survive a 40-year apocalypse without learning the devil's tricks. The Polish nobility realized that massive stone castles were perfect for survival, but terrible for expansion. To push back, they needed to weaponize the very tactics that almost erased them. They stripped down their heavy, cumbersome knights. They bred lighter, faster Eastern horses. They kept the devastating kinetic energy of the heavy lance, but integrated highly mobile light cavalry skirmishers direct, engineered rip-offs of the Mongol horse archers. Poland created a fluid, hybrid military doctrine. But a new army is useless without a target. Who is going to pay for this new war machine? To understand the true brilliance of Poland's ultimate revenge, you have to look at a ledger, not a battlefield. The Mongol Empire didn't invade Europe just for gold or territory. They invaded for humans. The Golden Horde's economy was heavily dependent on a massive, industrialized slave trade. They harvested European peasants and sold them to Genoese and Venetian merchants in Crimea. By building the hard points, locking the population inside impenetrable stone fortresses, and burning the countryside, Poland didn't just starve the Mongol horses. They crashed the Mongol stock market. No Polish captives meant zero export revenue. Zero revenue meant Nogai Khan couldn't pay his tribal chieftains. When a mercenary empire built on endless expansion suddenly hits negative cash flow, the mathematical certainty of their success turns into a mathematical death spiral. The Mongols hadn't just lost a battle, they had been economically suffocated. This financial ruin fueled the Mongol Civil War. In 1299, the ultimate irony played out. Nogai Khan, the terror of Europe, the man who sought to decapitate the Polish state, was hunted down and killed by a common Russian soldier in the service of Tokhta Khan. His severed head was paraded as a trophy. Poetic, brutal justice. But the death of Nogai didn't fix the Horde. It left a massive, bleeding power vacuum in Eastern Europe, and Poland was ready to fill it. Under leaders like Władysław the Elbow High, and later Casimir the Great, Poland stopped playing defense. The shattered Rus principalities, once firmly under the Mongol boot, were now up for grabs. Poland pushed east. They aggressively annexed territories the Golden Horde could no longer afford to hold. The anvil didn't just shatter the hammer, it melted it down and forged a new sword. But history abhors a vacuum. By eliminating the Mongol threat, Poland inadvertently invited a new monster to the table. With the eastern border suddenly quiet, a new existential threat realized Poland was growing too powerful. The Teutonic Knights. These weren't lightly armored horse archers from the steppe. They were ironclad, fanatical European crusaders who operated with ruthless industrial efficiency. The Teutonic Order looked at Poland not as a fellow Christian ally, but as prime real estate. They expected an easy campaign against a kingdom they thought was still exhausted from decades of Mongol raids. They were dead wrong. When the Teutonic Knights attacked, they didn't find the slow, bickering feudal lords of 1241. They walked into a buzzsaw. They faced a deeply centralized state with an economy hyper-optimized for total war. The stone fortresses Leszek the Black, built to stop Mongol trebuchets, proved equally effective against German siege engines. The plunging crossbow fire that decimated starving horse archers ripped through Teutonic plate armor just as easily. Poland had been beta testing its survival against the most lethal force on the planet for 40 years. The Teutonic Knights were just another stress test. The ultimate testament to this evolution happened in the early 14th century. A fractured Mongol raiding party, desperate and starving, attempted one final incursion into Polish territory. This wasn't Subutai's grand invasion. It was a pathetic smash-and-grab attempt by a dying empire. In 1241, the Polish elite would have charged blindly and died. In 1287, they would have hidden behind walls and starved them out. But now, the Polish hybrid cavalry rode out and hunted the Mongols in the open field. They intercepted the raiding party before they could even deploy. The Mongols tried their signature feigned retreat. The Poles didn't fall for it. They countered with precision flanking maneuvers, pinning the horse archers against the riverbanks and hacking them to pieces. It was a flawless tactical execution. The remnants of the Golden Horde were completely butchered. The tables had turned so violently that surviving Mongol warriors began defecting. They begged to join the Polish army as mercenaries. The invaders had become the hired help. How does an empire that erased cities become a footnote in someone else's military ledger? Absolute, uncompromising adaptation. Most history books focus on the tragedy of Legnica because blood makes good copy. They show you the sacks of severed ears. They show you the decapitated duke. They want you to believe the myth of the unstoppable Mongol horde. But the real lesson of the 13th century isn't about how to destroy a kingdom. It's about how to engineer an apex predator. The Mongols were a math problem. Subutai and Batu Khan treated Europe like a chessboard, assuming their opponents didn't even know how the pieces moved. Leszek the Black and his successors didn't just learn the rules of the game. They flipped the board. They realized that chivalry is a suicide pact when you're fighting for survival. They traded honor for stone. They traded glory for starvation. They turned their own landscape into a weapon and let the Mongol war machine eat itself alive. The Golden Horde came to Europe expecting a slaughter. They left as a broken, bankrupt shadow, forever haunted by the kingdom that simply refused to die. To understand exactly how the Mongol war machine snapped in the winter of 1287, you have to look at the thermostat. The Mongols loved winter warfare. To them, frozen rivers weren't obstacles, they were highways. When the Mongol commanders, Talabuga and Nogai Khan, crossed into Poland, the sub-zero temperatures were supposed to be their ultimate advantage. Winter froze the mud, allowing their horses to sprint. It paralyzed local European militias. It was the absolute perfect weather for a blitzkrieg. But Leszek the Black knew this. He didn't fight the winter, he weaponized it. The Mongols rode in expecting a frozen highway leading to easy loot. Instead, they rode into a meticulously engineered void. Every grain silo was completely empty. Every well was poisoned or filled with rocks. Every cow, pig, and sack of wheat had been pulled behind 50-foot stone walls. The Polish countryside had been stripped of its calories, and for an invasion force of 30,000 Mongols and roughly 100,000 horses, 0 calories is a mathematical death sentence, but starvation is a slow killer. Leszek needed something to butcher them fast. Enter the heavy arbalest. To the Mongol horde, the European crossbow was a structural glitch in their matrix. Mongol light cavalry relied on keeping their distance. Their entire doctrine was built on firing compound bows from 50 yards and staying completely out of reach. It was a game of lethal tag. But a Polish defender standing on a stone parapet, cranking a heavy steel prod crossbow, flipped that math upside down. They could launch a massive, armor-piercing iron bolt at over 150 feet per second. The kinetic energy was catastrophic. It didn't just pierce Mongol lamellar armor. It shattered ribs, punctured lungs, and pinned elite warriors to their horses from 200 yards away. The hunter was suddenly getting sniped from a distance they couldn't even see, let alone counter. For the first time in their history, the untouchable Mongol horse archers were completely outranged. But the Mongols weren't just archers. They were the greatest siege engineers on the planet. They had cracked Chinese megacities. Surely, a Polish stone castle shouldn't be a problem, right? Wrong. The Mongols had the blueprints to build massive, city-crushing trebuchets. But blueprints don't build weapons. timber does. And Leszek's ruthless scorched-earth policy hadn't just removed the food. The Poles had actively clear-cut the forests around their major fortresses. There were no trees left to fell. Worse, the ground was frozen solid into a concrete like permafrost. You can't dig siege trenches in sub-zero permafrost without heavy iron tools and thousands of expendable slaves. The Mongols had neither. Outside the walls of Sandomierz, Talabuga's army hit a hard, literal stone wall of reality. They couldn't shoot over it. They couldn't batter it down. They couldn't starve the city out because they were starving much faster than the defenders. Within 2 weeks, the Mongol logistical train completely flatlined. Horses began dropping dead in the snow. To a Mongol warrior, his horse is his life, his mobility, and his combat superiority. Eating their own mounts meant giving up their only ticket back to the steppe. It was a psychological breaking point. But 50 miles south, the real disaster was just getting started. Nogai Khan, the undisputed terror of Eastern Europe, was staring at the walls of Krakow. He saw the exact same impossible math: impregnable stone, plunging crossbow fire, starving, freezing horses. Nogai was a tactical genius, but a genius without options is just a hostage to his environment. He made the only call left in the Mongol playbook. He splintered his massive, concentrated army. He broke the horde down into dozens of small, desperate foraging parties and sent them into the dense Polish forests to find anything edible. This was exactly what the Poles wanted. It was the trigger Leszek the Black had been waiting 40 years to pull. The moment the Mongols broke formation and scattered, the heavy stone doors of the Polish fortresses swung open. The prey finally came out to hunt. But they didn't send out panicked peasant militias. They sent out a newly designed breed of heavy cavalry. For decades, the Polish knights had been an absolute joke to the Mongols. In 1241, they were slow, prideful, and easily baited into the feigned retreat. Not anymore. The new Polish cavalry had evolved. They rode lighter, faster horses bred from captured Eastern stock. They had studied Mongol tactics for an entire generation. When a starving Mongol foraging party wandered into a narrow, snow-choked ravine near Stary Sącz, they heard the terrifying rumble of hooves. But there was nowhere to maneuver. This is where the Mongol combat doctrine suffered a fatal system failure. A horse archer needs an open plain to circle, skirmish, and retreat. In a tight valley, hemmed in by steep rocks, deep snow, and thick pine trees, a horse archer is just a freezing man in leather armor. The Polish-Hungarian heavy cavalry slammed into them like an armored freight train. It wasn't a battle. It was pest control. The heavy lances tore through the static, starved Mongol units. The Poles didn't fall for fake retreats. They didn't chase ghosts. They systematically boxed the Mongols in, blocked the exits, and initiated a brutal, close-quarters slaughter. The invincible Golden Horde was literally hacked to pieces in the mud, screaming for reinforcements that would never come. When the handful of survivors dragged themselves back to Nogai Khan's command camp, they brought back a disease that kills empires: panic. Nogai Khan realized his entire operational structure was disintegrating. His elite veterans were freezing. His horses were being eaten. His fragmented foraging parties were being actively hunted and exterminated by an enemy that refused to fight fair. For the first time in his legendary career, the kingmaker of the Mongol Empire had to look at his generals and issue a command that defied their very religion: retreat. But the Poles weren't going to let them just pack up and walk away. As the remnants of the Mongol horde limped back toward the Rus border, the Polish forces initiated a relentless, agonizing pursuit. This was the absolute poetic inversion of 1241. The Mongols were now the ones being endlessly harassed, ambushed, and picked apart from the shadows. Polish light cavalry rode parallel to their flanks, firing armor-piercing bolts and vanishing back into the tree line. It was psychological torture. The Golden Horde left behind thousands of frozen corpses, abandoned siege equipment, and their godlike aura of invincibility. The withdrawal was so catastrophic that the geopolitical center of the world violently shifted overnight. You see, the Mongol Empire operated entirely on fear. If you stop being terrifying, your vassals start doing the math. When word reached the Russian principalities and the Hungarian plains that the great Nogai Khan had been whipped and chased out of Poland by guys with crossbows and stone walls, the Mongol stock market crashed. The Golden Horde's entire economy was based on human trafficking and extortion. Poland had completely blockaded the slave harvest. No Polish captives meant zero export revenue. Zero revenue meant Nogai Khan couldn't pay his tribal warlords. And unpaid warlords operating under a humiliated Khan only do one thing. They mutiny. The Polish victory didn't just save their kingdom. It acted as a financial and psychological detonator inside the Mongol Empire. The Horde rapidly descended into a brutal, cannibalistic civil war. Nogai Khan was soon fighting for his life against his own people, ultimately being decapitated by a rival faction. The apex predator started eating itself. And Poland? Poland didn't go back to normal. They couldn't. The 40-year trauma of the Mongol invasions had fundamentally rewired their cultural DNA. They were now a hyper-militarized, paranoid superpower in training. They looked east at the burning, fractured Mongol territories. They didn't see a threat anymore. They saw free real estate. Under the aggressive, visionary leadership of Władysław the Elbow High, Poland pushed its borders outward, swallowing the very territories the Mongols were forced to abandon. The anvil had not just shattered the hammer, it had melted it down and forged a brand new sword. They optimized their entire national economy for total war. They built a rapid response communication network. They turned the trauma of their near extinction into the blueprint for a dominant European state. But here's the terrifying paradox of medieval geopolitics. When you become the biggest, deadliest kid on the block, you don't find peace. You just attract a much better class of monster. With the Mongol threat neutralized, the eastern border finally went quiet. But the silence was a trap. Poland's rapid territorial expansion and sudden influx of wealth caught the attention of an entirely different kind of apex predator. One that didn't ride light horses or shoot compound bows. They wore 100-pound steel plate armor. They carried massive broadswords. They operated with a cold, industrial fanaticism, and they believed that God himself had ordered them to take Polish land. The Teutonic Knights were watching. They looked at the Polish borders and assumed they were dealing with a kingdom still exhausted and bleeding from decades of Mongol raids. They expected a quick, localized crusade against a weak target. They were dead wrong. They were about to kick in the door of a nation that had just spent 40 years learning exactly how to kill the devil. The Teutonic Order wasn't just an army. It was a multinational military corporation, backed by the Vatican, financed by Western European nobility, and completely addicted to territorial expansion. They wore massive steel plate armor and white mantles with black crosses. To the rest of the known world, they were the ultimate expression of holy war. They operated with a cold, terrifying industrial efficiency. When the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights looked across the northern border into Poland, he didn't see a threat. He saw a victim. He saw a nation that had spent the last half-century being repeatedly burned to the ground by the Golden Horde. He assumed the Polish treasury was empty. He assumed their spirit was broken. He assumed wrong. In 1327, the Teutonic Knights launched their invasion. They crossed the border, expecting to find the outdated, slow-moving Polish feudal armies of 1241. They expected wooden palisades they could easily set on fire and panicked peasants they could harvest for forced labor. Instead, they walked straight into a nationwide booby trap. The first thing the Teutonic scouts realized was that the landscape was wrong. The roads they planned to use for their heavy supply trains were suspiciously quiet. The open plains where they wanted to deploy their devastating heavy cavalry charges had been intentionally flooded or blocked by felled trees. The Germans were trying to fight a standard European war, but Poland wasn't fighting a European war anymore. They were fighting a steppe war. The Teutonic vanguard moved toward the major Polish settlements expecting a quick siege, but the wooden forts were gone. In their place stood Leszek the Black's terrifying legacy, a brutal, interconnected network of massive stone fortresses. The Germans brought standard trebuchets, assuming the walls would crack. The walls didn't even flinch. But a fortress is just a rock if you don't have teeth to defend it. And the Poles had spent 40 years sharpening their teeth. As the Teutonic heavy infantry marched into range to prepare their siege camps, the sky didn't fill with the erratic, inaccurate fire of standard bows. It filled with steel. The Polish defenders unleashed mass volleys of heavy crossbow fire. But these weren't standard hunting bolts. The Poles had engineered heavy, armor-piercing bodkin points designed specifically to punch through the thick, lamellar armor of a Mongol horseman. When a bolt designed to stop a charging Mongol at 200 yards hits a German knight in early plate armor, the math is catastrophic. The kinetic energy shattered Teutonic breastplates, pinned men to the frozen mud, and turned the German siege lines into an absolute meat grinder. The Teutonic commanders were stunned. Their infantry was bleeding out, and they hadn't even breached the outer gates. But sieges take time, and time requires food. The Germans weren't worried. They had massive supply trains rolling in from Prussia. They didn't know that Poland's new military doctrine was entirely built around destroying supply chains. While the Teutonic main force was bogged down staring at impenetrable stone walls, the Polish hybrid cavalry was unleashed. This was the ultimate irony of the 14th century. The Polish light cavalry wasn't fighting like European knights. They were fighting exactly like the Mongols. They rode fast, unarmored Eastern horses. They didn't engage the Teutonic heavy cavalry in open combat. They bypassed the main army entirely and hunted the German supply columns in the deep forests. A heavy Teutonic knight on a massive warhorse is a medieval tank, but a tank without fuel is just a steel coffin. The Polish skirmishers ambushed the wagon trains, burned the grain, slaughtered the pack animals, and vanished back into the tree line before the German heavy cavalry could even mount up. It was psychological warfare. The Teutonic knights were being bled dry by an enemy they couldn't catch, fighting a war they couldn't understand. But the Grand Master of the Order refused to back down. He needed a decisive open field battle to break the Polish resistance. In September 1331, he finally got his wish. The Battle of Płaus. A massive Teutonic force emerged from the morning fog, deploying their legendary heavy cavalry into an unbreakable wall of steel lances. This was the exact scenario that had erased the Polish army at Legnica in 1241. A frontal clash of heavy armor. But King Władysław the Elbow High wasn't going to play their game. He knew that if you fight a tank head-on, you die. So, he flipped the script. Instead of ordering a glorious suicidal charge, Władysław sent in his light hybrid cavalry. They rode out, closed the distance, fired a devastating volley of missiles into the German lines, and immediately wheeled their horses around and retreated. The Teutonic Knights were furious. They were bleeding. Their pride was wounded, and the enemy was running away. It was an insult to their chivalry. So, the German knights broke formation. They lowered their lances, spurred their massive war horses, and charged after the fleeing Poles. It was the oldest trick in the Devil's playbook, the feigned retreat. The Poles were literally using Suboty's signature Mongol tactic against the best heavy cavalry in Western Europe, and the Teutonic Knights fell for it completely. Blinded by their heavy helmets and their own arrogance, the German cavalry charged blindly into the Polish mud, losing their cohesion, their momentum, and their protective formations. They chased the ghosts right into the trap. Władysław had kept his elite heavy knights completely hidden in the reserve. The moment the German cavalry stretched themselves thin and exhausted their horses in the damp earth, the Polish heavy armor dropped the hammer. They slammed into the fragmented Teutonic lines with apocalyptic force. It wasn't a battle of honor. It was a forensic, localized slaughter. The invincible white mantles were dragged into the mud and hacked to pieces by an enemy that fought with the cold, mathematical brutality of a steppe warlord. By the time the sun set at Płaus, the myth of Teutonic invincibility was dead. The German forces managed to retreat, but the psychological damage was permanent. They realized with sheer horror that the nation they thought was a weak, traumatized victim had actually been vaccinated by the apocalypse. The Mongols hadn't destroyed Poland. They had forged it into a hyper-lethal, adaptable superstate. But winning a battle doesn't win a war. Wars cost money. And the Teutonic Order had the financial backing of the entire Holy Roman Empire. If Poland was going to survive in this new, hyper-violent neighborhood, they couldn't just be tactically brilliant. They had to become an economic titan. They needed a war chest that could outlast the Vatican. Enter King Casimir the Great. Casimir understood the final, most crucial lesson of the Mongol invasions. An empire isn't built on swords, it's built on ledgers. While the Golden Horde was busy cannibalizing itself in a bloody civil war, the massive trade routes connecting the east to the west were left wide open. Casimir didn't just rebuild Polish cities. He transformed them into heavily fortified, tax-generating trade hubs. He offered absolute religious tolerance and state protection to Jewish refugees fleeing violent persecution in Western Europe. This wasn't just a humanitarian gesture. It was a macroeconomic masterstroke. Overnight, Poland absorbed an influx of highly literate, financially sophisticated merchants and bankers. They didn't just boost the economy, they hypercharged it. Casimir standardized the currency. He built specialized customs houses. He locked down the lucrative salt trade, turning the Wieliczka salt mine into a medieval ATM that funded the entire Polish military complex. The kingdom was drowning in cash. There is a famous saying, Casimir found a Poland made of wood and left it made of stone. But history books often misunderstand this quote. It wasn't about architecture, it was about military logistics. Casimir used his massive new war chest to construct a staggering network of over 50 state-of-the-art stone castles, perfectly positioned along every major invasion route. He built a nationwide defense grid that was mathematically impossible to besiege. The Teutonic Knights looked at this booming, fortress-laden superpower and realized the terrifying truth. Their window of opportunity hadn't just closed, it had been bricked over. Poland had evolved from a fractured, bleeding feudal state into the absolute apex predator of Eastern Europe. They had the heaviest armor of the West, the lightning-fast skirmish tactics of the East, and a banking system that could finance a forever war. But to completely secure their dominance, Poland needed to do something that would terrify the rest of the continent. They needed a partner. Just across their eastern border lay the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. They were the last pagan state in Europe, a massive, fierce territory that the Teutonic Knights had been trying to conquer for a century. The Lithuanians were brilliant guerrilla fighters, but they lacked the heavy armor and the financial infrastructure of a modern state. Poland had the armor. Poland had the money. In 1385, the two nations did the unthinkable. Through a strategic royal marriage, they fused. The Polish-Lithuanian Union created a geopolitical monster. It was a sovereign landmass that stretched from the Baltic Sea almost to the Black Sea. It was a superpower that combined Polish heavy cavalry, Mongol-inspired tactics, cutting-edge stone fortifications, and Lithuanian manpower. The Teutonic Knights had spent decades trying to destroy both nations separately. Now, they were staring down the barrel of a united empire that was specifically designed to annihilate them. The climax of this evolution would eventually arrive at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where the Polish-Lithuanian war machine would systematically dismantle the Teutonic Order in one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the Middle Ages. The German crusaders would be broken, their Grand Master killed, and their military dominance erased from history. But Grunwald wasn't a miracle. It was an inevitability. It was the final payout of a strategy that began over a century earlier in the smoking ashes of Krakow. When Subutai and the Golden Horde crossed into Europe in 1241, they thought they were performing a routine harvest. They thought they were dealing with static, unimaginative knights who would always fall for the same feigned retreats and always die on schedule. They treated warfare like an automated assembly line of death. But they made the one mistake an apex predator can never make. They left a survivor. They left behind a people who looked at the apocalypse not as the end of the world, but as a blueprint. Poland stripped away the romanticized lies of chivalry. They stopped fighting for honor and started fighting for survival. They starved their own lands, froze the greatest nomadic army in human history, and turned the terrifying momentum of the Mongol Empire into a suicidal death spiral. Most history books stop at the catastrophe because it's easy. It's a clean narrative. The big bad horde crushed the helpless Europeans. But the truth is far more brutal and infinitely more fascinating. The Mongol invasion of Poland wasn't the destruction of a nation. It was an extreme, traumatic vaccination. It forced a medieval society to aggressively mutate, to re-engineer its economy, its architecture, and its soul. The Mongols arrived as the undisputed masters of the world, but they left as victims of their own arrogance, shattered against the stone walls of a kingdom that learned how to bite back. This is how you stop an unstoppable force. You don't build a bigger army. You build a better anvil. Looking back at the burning flow of the 13th century, we do not just see military maps or dry casualty numbers. We are looking at a major surgery on the soul of a nation. The three great invasions of the Mongol Empire were not just wars. They were tsunamis testing the survival of Western civilization. And Poland, the nation once considered a side quest in Subutai's roadmap to conquer the Atlantic, transformed itself into a massive immune system, a biological barrier that the greatest war machine in history could not digest. The answer to the greatest mystery: why an empire that had crushed the Jin dynasty, wiped out Khwarezm, and turned Russia into a vassal fell before an exhausted kingdom of Poland does not lie in any miracle. It lies in a ruthless betrayal of their own old ideals. Poland won because they dared to trade glory for survival. They realized that before a monster with no compassion, knightly pride was a death sentence. They learned how to turn fear into architecture, turn pain into mathematics, and turn the very cruel tactics of their opponent into the weapons that finished them off. The invincible weakness that the Mongols never expected was their absolute dependence on momentum and the adaptation of the enemy. When the Poles stopped moving on the battlefield and hid behind rigid stone walls, they stripped the steppe cavalry of its oxygen, mobility. When the Poles applied scorched-earth tactics to their own homeland, they turned the speed of the Mongol army into a death race with starvation. The Mongol machine was too perfect for confronting traditional armies, but it was too cumbersome to deal with an impenetrable hardpoint. They lost because they were too good at hunting, but completely blind when the prey decided to turn into a wall. The sacks filled with the ears of knights at Legnica in 1241 were once a declaration of the end of an era. But by 1287, the snow-covered forests and cold stone fortresses of Poland themselves had become the graveyard for the myth of invincibility. The image of Polish cavalry, those who had once been slaughtered by the feigned retreat tactic, now using that exact psychological blow to strike down the steel warriors of the Teutonic Order, is the ultimate proof of evolution. That was not just revenge. It was the complete appropriation of the enemy's military legacy to build a new empire. The later rise of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not an accident of history. It was the result of a nation that had been forged in a fiery hell. They had learned that strength does not come from oaths of honor on the battlefield, but from a solid economy, an interconnected fortress system, and an army that knew how to combine the heavy weight of the West with the flexibility of the East. Poland became the shield of the Church, but in reality, they were the anvil where the Mongol sledgehammer struck down so hard until it shattered itself. We often praise military geniuses like Subutai or Genghis Khan, but the truly greatest story of the 13th century is the story of the bricklayers, the silent archers on the walls of Sandomierz, and the farmers who chose to burn their own granaries so the enemy would have nothing to eat. They were the engineers of an impossible victory. They proved to the world that to kill a monster, you do not need to become a monster, but you must deeply understand its mindset and then turn its very perfection into an inescapable trap. The Mongol Empire disappeared, and the once mighty Khanates are now just footnotes in history books. But the Kingdom of Poland, from the ashes of burned-down cities, rose up to reshape the map of Europe for centuries. Their legacy is not one-time glorious feats, but an eternal lesson in resilience, that no power is unstoppable, no defeat is permanent, and when a nation decides to learn from its own pain, they will become a force that even the conquerors of the entire world must fear and step back from. That was the most resounding response sent back from the blood-soaked fields of Legnica, a reminder that the spirit of a nation forged in stone and fire will always be more enduring than any empire built on horseback. Looking back at the burning flow of the 13th century, we do not just see military maps or dry casualty numbers. We are looking at a major surgery on the soul of a nation. The three great invasions of the Mongol Empire were not just wars. They were tsunamis testing the survival of Western civilization. And Poland, the nation once considered a side quest in Subutai's roadmap to conquer the Atlantic, transformed itself into a massive immune system, a biological barrier that the greatest war machine in history could not digest. The answer to the greatest mystery: why an empire that had crushed the Jin dynasty, wiped out Khwarezm, and turned Russia into a vassal, fell before an exhausted kingdom of Poland, does not lie in any miracle. It lies in a ruthless betrayal of their own old ideals. Poland won because they dared to trade glory for survival. They realized that before a monster with no compassion, knightly pride was a death sentence. They learned how to turn fear into architecture, turn pain into mathematics, and turn the very cruel tactics of their opponent into the weapons that finished them off. The invincible weakness that the Mongols never expected was their absolute dependence on momentum and the adaptation of the enemy. When the Poles stopped moving on the battlefield and hid behind rigid stone walls, they stripped the steppe cavalry of its oxygen, mobility. When the Poles applied scorched-earth tactics to their own homeland, they turned the speed of the Mongol army into a death race with starvation. The Mongol machine was too perfect for confronting traditional armies, but it was too cumbersome to deal with an impenetrable hardpoint. They lost because they were too good at hunting, but completely blind when the prey decided to turn into a wall. The sacks filled with the ears of knights at Legnica in 1241 were once a declaration of the end of an era. But by 1287, the snow-covered forests and cold stone fortresses of Poland themselves had become the graveyard for the myth of invincibility. The image of Polish cavalry, those who had once been slaughtered by the feigned retreat tactic, now using that exact psychological blow to strike down the steel warriors of the Teutonic Order, is the ultimate proof of evolution. That was not just revenge. It was the complete appropriation of the enemy's military legacy to build a new empire. The later rise of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not an accident of history. It was the result of a nation that had been forged in a fiery hell. They had learned that strength does not come from oaths of honor on the battlefield, but from a solid economy, an interconnected fortress system, and an army that knew how to combine the heavy weight of the West with the flexibility of the East. Poland became the shield of the church, but in reality, they were the anvil where the Mongol sledgehammer struck down so hard until it shattered itself. We often praise military geniuses like Subutai or Genghis Khan, but the truly greatest story of the 13th century is the story of the bricklayers, the silent archers on the walls of Sandomierz, and the farmers who chose to burn their own granaries so the enemy would have nothing to eat. They were the engineers of an impossible victory. They proved to the world that, to kill a monster, you do not need to become a monster, but you must deeply understand its mindset, and then turn its very perfection into an inescapable trap. The Mongol Empire disappeared, and the once mighty Khanates are now just footnotes in history books. But the Kingdom of Poland, from the ashes of burned-down cities, rose up to reshape the map of Europe for centuries. Their legacy is not one-time glorious feats, but an eternal lesson in resilience. That no power is unstoppable, no defeat is permanent, and when a nation decides to learn from its own pain, they will become a force that even the conquerors of the entire world must fear and step back from. That was the most resounding response sent back from the blood-soaked fields of Legnica, a reminder that the spirit of a nation forged in stone and fire will always be more enduring than any empire built on horseback. Every loop of fear has closed. The question is no longer how to survive, but how to forge a future where pain becomes the foundation of power. The greatest predator in history found its limit not at the horizon, but in the will of those who turned annihilation into a blueprint for greatness. The final battle did not take place on the field, but in the minds of those who dared to completely change their ego to protect what they loved. And that was the sweetest, most brutal revenge that history has ever witnessed. When the red dust of the steppe hooves finally settled on the snow-covered fields, history did not just record the retreat of an army, but also marked the rebirth of a national soul. The story of Poland and the Mongol Empire is not merely a chronicle of sieges or political schemes. It is an epic hymn about the evolution of the human will at the threshold of extinction. The greatest lesson that posterity receives from these blood-stained pages of history is this: true resilience does not lie in enduring pain, but in the ability to turn that pain into a blueprint for greatness. The Poles did not choose to weep for the knights who fell at Legnica. They chose to dissect their own defeat with a ruthless sobriety. They taught us that, when facing an enemy that cannot be defeated by brute strength, the ultimate weapon is adaptation. They abandoned the illusions of classical knightly glory to embrace a thorny new reality, where lifeless stone walls and armor-piercing arrows were worth more than 10,000 oaths of honor. The Mongol Empire, the most powerful military entity to ever exist on the Eurasian continent, ultimately stumbled not because they grew weak, but because they encountered a hard point molded from the very fire they had ignited. Poland became the steel anvil where all the arrogance of the horsemen of the apocalypse had to shatter. The transformation from a rotting wooden kingdom into an impregnable stone fortress is a testament to an eternal truth. An enemy can seize land, can burn down cities, but they can never rule a nation that has learned how to turn trauma into constructive strength. Looking deep into the legacy of the 13th century, we realize a profound enlightenment. History does not belong to the strongest at the starting line, but to those who know how to learn the fastest in the dark. The rise of Poland from the ashes to later become a European superpower is a resounding answer to those who believe that destiny is a fixed path. Every stone that built Wawel, every arrow fired from the walls of Sandomierz, carries the message of an intellectual revenge, where the hunted silently learns to read the predator's mind to then set the most perfect trap. The highest emotion that remains is not hatred, but a burning pride in the limitless potential of humanity when pushed into a corner. It is the moment we realize that, even in the darkest nights of history, light does not come from the outside, but from the forging of willpower inside every fortress, every village, and every unyielding heart. The Mongol machine might have conquered the whole world, but they had to stop before a kingdom that knew how to turn pain into iron and stone. Poland did not just survive. They won by completely redefining how the world perceives power. And in the echoes of history, we still hear the resonance of a nation that stood up from the ashes, with the smile of one who has decoded fear and turned it into the foundation for a glorious millennium. Poland's revenge was not merely a military counterattack, but the victory of technical thinking over the myth of invincibility. When the Mongol sledgehammer shattered on the stone anvil of Leszek and Casimir, a new era opened, where data, logistics, and ruthless pragmatism became the new metrics of power. But the story of humanity's evolution at the threshold of extinction does not stop at the snowfields of Poland. History is a series of fierce tests, where civilizations are constantly put into the furnace to filter out the most enduring values. What you have just witnessed is proof that, even when facing a war machine considered a natural disaster, an algorithm always exists to decipher and break it. We spend hundreds of hours researching, analyzing, and recreating these survival codes, from the stone fortresses of Central Europe to the warships in the Mediterranean, to bring you the most realistic look at how the world truly operates. If you feel that these analyses of the stone versus speed strategy provide a new perspective on power and adaptation, then that is why you belong in this community. We invite you to hit the subscribe button to become a part of those who do not just view history as mere tales, but see it as a massive treasure trove of data on strategy and survival. Subscribing is how you ensure that you will always be there when we dissect the next complex structures of the greatest empires. And right now, to continue the train of thought on how underdogs can jailbreak the systems of giants, I have a recommendation just for you. Look at the video displaying on the screen. It is an analysis of how a seemingly simple technical innovation completely changed the face of the battlefield and overthrew an old world order. Click on it right now to see that, whether it is Mongol cavalry or any state-of-the-art power, every unconquerable system always harbors a fatal flaw waiting to be exploited. We will continue our journey of decoding the laws of history right there,